Hello, and welcome to Bedhead Books. Today we are going to be talking about Liberation Through Hearing by Richard Russell. This is Rap, Rave and the Rise of XL Recordings, for whom Richard Russell has been A&R coordinator and producer since the early 90s. The label has broken such stars as Adele, Dizzy Rascal, MIA, The Prodigy, as well as taking on a number of US signings such as Vampire Weekend. Russell himself actually teamed up with another record man, Nick Hawkes, to form a duo known as Kicks Like a Mule, who attained a UK hit with a song known as The Bouncer.
Your name's not down, you're not coming in.
Russell grew up in 1970s London. He was born into a Jewish family and draws the parallel quite often between music and religion in terms of searching for answers and finding things out about yourself. And so, for example, he argues that if you look beyond the mainstream in both music and religion, you can find what it is that you're looking for that satisfies you as an individual. So, for example, you dig amongst the mainstream religions, you can find beliefs and values that summarize you, and the same goes for music as well. You dig beyond the mainstream, you find artists and genres that you more closely identify with. And he brings this back a couple of times throughout the book by talking about his own experience with meditation and mindfulness and therapy. And he also acknowledges that the title of the book is actually drawn from the Tibetan book of the living and the dead, and the whole idea of music giving us freedom, liberating us, allowing us to do things that we would not be able to do otherwise is a very, very big theme of this book. Russell has quite a few nuggets of advice that he shares with us throughout. I think the first one that stands out to me is that the greatest achievement in music is to inspire other musicians. And as an example of this, he points to Malcolm McLaren, who had been active in management, so for Sex Pistols and for the New York Dolls, but he started making inroads to his own music career in the 1980s and going in a completely different direction, taking up the mantle of hip-hop and breaking through with a song called Buffalo Gals, which draws on an old country song called Buffalo Boy, Go Round the Outside.
Round the outside.
Russell got his professional start working for some record stores in the UK, specifically ones that stocked more independent releases and what were known as white labels, so releases that had been pressed and put together by the artists themselves independent of a label, and the intention was very much to have something out ready for the club at the weekend, as was the rave culture that was burgeoning at the time. He found himself doing the same thing essentially over in New York a couple of years later, and that of course really put him in touch with the roots of house and techno music, and he brought that influence back with him when he came to work for XL. So XL Recordings was co-founded by the aforementioned Nick Hawkes and Tim Palmer as an offshoot from City Beat Records, which was itself an offshoot from Beggar's Banquet. We'll probably talk about them a little bit later in the review. But Russell joined them around the early 90s. Once in the A&R department, Russell came into contact with a demo tape by a 19-year-old called Liam Howlett. The tape was listed under the name of Prodigy. Russell invested his time and his energy into producing or co-producing with Liam Howlett the first couple of Prodigy albums, and sure enough, it did become a huge thing, and later he recruited Keith Flint and Maxim, who were predominantly dancers, but he credits them with being the face of the group in a time where it was often about the music itself and the DJs and less about the artists. And so you need someone to front that vision, but you also need someone in the studio to bring that vision to life in the first place. And that was what he found with the Prodigy. So Russell, by his own admission, around the late 90s, kind of did get quite swept away with the success of the Prodigy. He was in the US with them a lot. There were drugs and alcohol floating around, and he kind of lost himself, as one would in that situation. He reckons that the position of A&R man, such as it is, went to his head, and this idea that, he was being paid for his music taste. It was so good that people were paying for him and trusting him to say what the next best thing was. And he just kind of crumbled a little bit under that. He found himself in therapy, where he went back to sort of the roots of his family and his upbringing, and sort of trying to reconnect with his parents, and the fact that, his ambition was a lot different from the ambition that they had in their minds for him, as is common among musicians, of course. After this, Russell found himself back in the studio with some of his heroes, Gil Scott-Heron, Bobby Womack, Damon Albarn. He also found himself away in Africa a few times as part of a music collective, which is a great summary, really, of how you can draw together so many different things in music, and it can all make sense in the end. The A&R executive who actually brought Adele to the label's attention only did so because he didn't have anyone else. He'd found Adele's MySpace page and found that she had 11,000 plays, which he considered to be too much, and he thought the record label were too late to sign her, that she would probably by now already be being courted by major labels. But she signed with XL because of the ethos, and obviously having met Richard Russell himself, she found out more about what his mission was as a producer, as an A&R man. He quotes in the book from John Hammond, who was the legendary record man for Columbia, who discovered Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, and earlier Billie Holiday. Hammond has said in his own memoir, published around the 1980s, that his role has been to facilitate the artistic vision of these artists he's worked with, to make sure that these albums and these songs get made. And that is his mission. That's what satisfies him most. And if they become famous, it's a byproduct. But Hammond says, and I'm sure Russell agrees with him, that anyone who cares solely about that is just a pain in the arse. The signing of Adele, along with other artists, including Dizzy Rascal, who won the Mercury Prize for his debut album, and as I mentioned, American acts such as White Stripes and Vampire Weekend, this really started to shift the scales of the label away from 12-inch singles into a more album-oriented market. Around the early 2000s, when Adele was breaking, this would probably have been the last time where physical albums were still selling in the numbers that downloads later started getting and streaming now gets. And so Adele could present her albums as artistic wholes. And Russo acknowledges Adele as being very clever and very selective with the people she works with. And so she would say, I want to work with this songwriter, that songwriter. She'll create what Russell describes as interesting turns of phrase, such as Chasing Pavements, Roaring in the Deep, Set Fire to the Rain, all that kind of thing that we know and love Adele for.
I am a musician, but I'm not a very good musician. I like working with very good musicians. When you've got someone in the room who's got a sort of simpler approach, that's got a value in the studio.
Throughout Liberation Through Hearing, Russell's intense passion for music remains at the fore. He says quite early on in the book that becoming a musician does not stop you being a music fan. That is a connection that you will always have. Rather than just learning your craft and moving on, you have to keep broadening your horizons and your mind with what you listen to, what you appreciate. And throughout the book, whenever he mentions artists that he admires, such as Gil Scott-Heron, earlier on he mentions KRS-One, he has a knack for compiling information about those artists and imparting them on to us in a way to suggest that he really cares very deeply about where him and his music and their music have come from. And so he will give us anywhere between a paragraph and 2 pages about a particular artist, their history, the albums they have made. And something I have to mention about this book, which has really made the experience of reading it a lot more interactive, is that it's split into 4 separate parts. And at the beginning of each part, there is a playlist that Russell has compiled. You can find most of it on Spotify. Some of the songs are not there due to licensing issues or that kind of thing. There's a few replacements and a few additions. If there's ones that you really want to find, then obviously you can chase them up. But as I say, this is a fantastic way of making the experience of the book interactive, because you can read a section of the book, go listen to some of the playlists, come back to the book, go back to the playlist. And it's really something that I've not mentioned before on this channel with a couple of other books, those namely being Mars by 1980 and Live Wires, that also feature very good, very strong, very eclectic playlists that you can use as an accompaniment to the book. I don't talk about this too much on this channel, but this book is excellently presented. If you look inside, there's all this cover art from the various XL records that have been released. There's fantastic attention to detail throughout the book. They've even reprinted this interview that the Vinyl Mania store conducted with legendary DJ Larry Levin. So in conclusion, this book is a really pleasurable experience. Russell is very savvy and clued up to the fact that with so many artists releasing their music independently, producers, A&R men, record labels are not absolutely necessary. So they do have to offer something different, something refreshing that you can't get everywhere else, and this is what Russell strives to do. But he's very humble about his position in all of it, that he can help artists, but only if the artists want to work with him. And he considers everything a collaboration. You know, he even says in the book, even though it's his name on it, the whole thing, the book, the label, everything associated with it is a collaboration. And indeed, XL Recordings would not have been able to survive were it not for the founding of Beggars Group, which is an offshoot from Beggars Banquet Records, which was formed by Martin Mills. Now, what Beggars Group have done is they have joined together a number of labels, including 4AD and Rough Trade and XL, of course, to assure that these labels can maintain their independence without kowtowing to what major labels want and getting sucked into the machinery, which of course is closing in further and further and further and further now, with almost everything being owned by UMG. This is a music lover's book if ever I've read one, and I'm going to have to give Richard Russell's Liberation Through Hearing a 10 out of 10. Thank you very much for watching. Remember to like and share this video. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Subscribe so that you can save your place for later. And remember, don't judge this book by its cover. I'm gonna put on an